Well, welcome back to Pastor. Today we're talking about one of the most personal and often challenging parts of pastoral ministry, counseling. Wes is here to share what it really looks like to shepherd people through the hardest part of life. Wes, it's good to see you.
It's good to see you too, Rob.
Well, thanks for being here as always. Well, Wes, I'm curious, how significant has counseling been in your decades of ministry as a pastor?
I think it would be fair to say that I could have had a full-time job doing nothing but counseling in my 3 decades of pastoring.
Wow. What percentage of your time did it take up, do you think?
Oh gosh, it's hard to know where the counseling ends and just general relationship begins. I think that it's possible that it was at least 10 hours a week. I think in a lot of weeks it was probably 10 to 20 hours. Of course, we lump counseling into shepherding, so that distinction, it's not like, well, that was a wellness visit, that was treatment for a problem. You're either counseling in the moment or you're counseling for the future. And it's all just a part of shepherding in my mind.
Can you explain that a little bit when you say counseling for the future? What do you mean by that?
Well, you're trying to prepare people. Let's say you're dealing with the issue of behavior with children. Well, you're at the same time as you help them with the exigency of a discipline problem, say, you're also seeding the ground for the future when perhaps that child as a teenager is very difficult to control and maybe as an adult goes astray and wants nothing to do with the faith. All of that's rolled in to the moment, so it has application to the future.
So you've said you could have had was a second part-time job almost. I know you're a pretty strategic guy with your time. So counseling must hold a very high value in your mind as a pastor. Why so?
Well, again, if you allow me to just put it under the rubric of shepherding, it's a particular kind of shepherding. I'd say this: you preach your sermon, the pastor leads primarily through his preaching and teaching, but then shepherding and counseling is the way that you knead those truths into the pores of your people. This is where you take the general ideas and customize them and try to help people see a difference in their particular lives. So without that, the sermon, not that it has no effect, but it's a little bit left hanging because they may just not see, well, this applies to this situation. This is really about this. Remember what we talked about on Sunday? That's really what we're dealing with here. This is actually a form of idolatry. So I think it's the way you get down into the nooks and crannies of people's souls. And it's very helpful for folk to see the gospel applied at that level in their lives.
So is it a little bit like taking the sermon and putting it into practice?
Yes, in a customized way, because although the gospel is the gospel, its application and relevance to each person is highly personal. And so you're trying to help them to see, okay, here's my life. How does the gospel apply to this? And you're getting down into the nooks and crannies. You're getting down into the real personal kind of details to see that the gospel is still the answer. It is the power of God, and it can address that scenario, but it's going to come at you in a particular way.
You know, I've heard it referred to as gospel counseling versus just counseling. Can you help me understand the difference?
Yeah, I may have coined that phrase, but I'm always leery of saying that. I don't know who else uses that phrase, but I've used that phrase for decades now. What I'm meaning by that is that marriage is never just about marriage. Child rearing is never just about child rearing. Struggles with particular besetting sins is never just struggles with those particular sins. It always goes back to the gospel. There's always something that takes it back to the gospel that's either misunderstood or misapplied. The Bible says that whatever is not of faith is sin. So no matter what we're struggling with, sins in marriage, sins in parenting, sins in your personal character, even sins of judging and being OCD about things that the Bible doesn't allow, it's always a gospel issue. So we're always seeking to show how the gospel resolves that, because the gospel alone is the power of God.
Can you give an example?
Yeah. So say you're dealing with marriage counseling. I'm just thinking off the top here. You're dealing with marriage counseling, and the husband is irritated with his wife. And maybe he's irritated with the way that she feels responsible for making sure everybody's needs are met. So no matter what they do, to him, she's kind of fussing about all the particulars. These people are coming over. We have to make sure this, we have to make sure that, or maybe with the kids, always worried about that. And he's irritated by it. Maybe even he gets a little embittered by it. All right, well, what does the gospel teach us? The gospel teaches us that we're to accept one another just as God in Christ has accepted us. And assuming she's not sinning, but this is just her way, there's a fundamental gospel problem there. He's forgetting that God has accepted him with all of his irritating idiosyncrasies in Christ. God's not up there being irritated with him because he's got this fetish or that fetish. And when he understands that, when he gets his head around that, he's in a much better position to accept her for her idiosyncrasies. It's a gospel issue, even though it comes out in a lot of snipping and sniping at one another in marriage.
I'm curious, Wes, after you've counseled somebody, they've been in your church for years, maybe you've had opportunity to counsel them here and there, do they get to a point where they can almost gospel counsel themselves?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the ability to counsel yourself, I would say, includes being able to make the adjustments. So they might know the right answers, but still they're not making the adjustments. And so a leader, an elder, a pastor comes in and helps them to follow through on what they know. But yeah, they've got the profile. They know, okay, this is really problem X. I got to go back to the fact that this is the fundamental issue. And now it's just a matter of whether or not we're going to act on that.
What makes a preacher, a pastor, a good counselor?
Well, I think going back to something we talked about in season 1, I think he has to have clarity. He has to be clear about the truth of the gospel. And he has to understand that the gospel is the answer. Regardless of the question, the gospel's the answer. But he also has to be clear about the counselee, about his congregant, what's really going on. And that's not going to happen without employing good listening skills, being able to ask helpful questions to really get a bead on what's going on. And that may take multiple sessions to be able to do that. It's easy to pigeonhole people. So you got to be careful not to just say, well, I've seen this before. Well, maybe you've seen something like this, but you've never seen this person before. So it's got to be somewhat unique. And then with that clarity, both of the gospel and of that person's particular situation, now you have to be willing to have courage and seek to graciously address the situation, even if that addressing is going to be painful or produce some kickback, some pushback. Let's say you're talking with somebody and they share with you a drinking problem. And, you could just say, well, they have a drinking problem. Well, you got to get behind that. Okay, tell me what's going on. What are the ticklers? What are the things that are causing you to think this is the answer? Let's deal with the reality that it's not the answer. But how long has this been going on? Are we really struggling with drunkenness? And is that drunkenness a prolonged pattern? And if so, are you willing to step back and at least ask yourself the question, am I really a Christian? Because drunkards shall not inherit the kingdom of God. So that could produce some alienation when you say that. You're dealing with the marriage situation and the husband and wife come in and the wife is very clear that she thinks it's a husband's problem. So you work for clarity on the situation. You're listening. You're getting feedback. Maybe you enlist a woman's counselor to help you. Sue helps me a lot. She's meeting individually with the woman. I'm meeting individually with the man. We come together. And then we finally sit down and say, we're not really sure that it's all his fault. Or we may even be saying we're not really sure that it's primarily his fault. These are very delicate situations. And I can assure you, if the couple came in and the woman was sure that what was needed was for him to get fixed, and you end up concluding, well, he may need to get fixed, but you need to get fixed too, you're going to get some pushback. So it takes some courage and, the ability to communicate these things well and not react. When people are when they're on the spot, when they're put on the spot that this is their problem, when Nathan said to David, you're the man, I have found that they bite. And it's not infrequent that they start going on the attack against you. And suddenly there's a whole litany of things they've never liked about you. It's amazing how the Adamic nature reigns, and we're just professional blame shifters. We're all professional blame shifters. And when we're on the hot seat, boy, we can load them up and let them rip. So you got to be able to communicate through that. A gentle answer turns away wrath. A harsh word stirs up anger. You got to hang in there. So I think you got to be clear, you got to be courageous, and you got to communicate in a godly way. That's not easy to do. Only by the grace of God can a pastor do that.
And you need to know them, right? Because you need to know how far you can push them. How far can we get in this, if we want to call it session? Yeah. I'm sure that's something you're always trying to juggle with. With this guy, I can push pretty hard. With this guy, I got to be a little softer, but we'll still get there.
Well, it depends. I mean, that sounds like an ideal rubric there, but it depends on the problem. And some problems, if you liken it to emergency rooms, there's just some problems you cannot wait around. It's an emergency situation, and you have to act quickly. And even though you don't have the benefit of knowing them as well as you do, that's where the courage comes in, that you've got to be willing to do what you think is best. And that may require an immediate triage. You've got a couple, and they're having significant marital problems, and you perceive that the woman is afraid. And you may have to step in and say, I think we need a period of separation here. Even though you don't know them very well, maybe your first appointment. So ideally, yes. But I think the pastor, the counselor, has to be ready. And I think this is where a pastor counselor is superior, because he's got the church behind him. He has the authority of the church behind him. He has the elders with him. And sometimes hard choices have to be made. And that's difficult for a private counselor to do.
Have you ever had anybody just get up and walk out on you?
Yes. More than one time I have.
Do they ever come back?
Yes. I've had some that have and some that haven't. But mostly reconciliation, and we move forward. And sometimes it's been at least partly my fault. But a lot of times you're trafficking in truths that they don't want to hear, and they're too immature to stay into the game, so they pick up their marbles and go home. But you got to come back and try to still work with that situation.
What do you ask, or what are you looking for before you're willing to counsel somebody?
In any situation, or are you thinking of particularly hard situations, Rob?
Yeah, I think in any situation. I'm curious, do they have to be reluctant? I guess maybe I'll ask this question. Do you often go to people and say, I wondered if we might take some time to talk?
Sometimes.
Or is it, hey, Wes, could we get some time to talk?
Yeah, I think you could break it down between annual checkups and going to the doctor because you think something's wrong. Now, admittedly, more counseling situations are stimulated by the congregant calling up the office because they think something's wrong and they want an appointment. But sometimes, even as a good doctor might see during a wellness visit, I think something's wrong. We've checked your blood. I think something's wrong. So it can work both ways. And I think a good shepherd is proactively visiting his people, connecting with his people, so that he's really being able to assess, is everyone doing okay? Are they doing well? Are they progressing in their faith? Or are there some indications that something may be wrong, even if they've not come to you, set up an appointment to talk to you? But in both situations, Rob, what we're looking for is ultimately for them to sign a release form. So let's say a couple is having marital problems. I want to first try to triage and see what's actually going on. And maybe we take a couple of sessions to try to do that. We come up with our diagnosis or a plan to try to address it, which includes our perception on what may be wrong. And we sit down and say, here's what we're thinking. And it may be difficult. The pathway may be challenging. And before we're done with that session, I don't assume they want to do that. I did it earlier in my counseling days, but I stopped doing it probably 20 years ago. We get done with that, and it's just like when you go in for surgery. What do you have to do? You have to sign a release form. So it's like, I'd like to move forward on this, but I would like to get your explicit permission that this is what you want. Now, we're not dealing with a sin issue that could be a church discipline scenario, because release form or not, if that's a situation, the elders have to move forward on those kind of situations. But we're talking about sort of a voluntary treatment. Let's call it that. Maybe it's elective surgery, but we still want that release form signed. Because if they're not going through at least the motions to say, I'm willing to go through with this protocol, the moment they don't like what you're doing, it's going to be nasty. So trying to get a release form, trying to get them to engage their will to go along with your protocol.
Are you talking about a literal release form?
No, not a literal, although I've contemplated it based on my experiences. I've really contemplated, notarized the whole 9 yards. But no, I'm not talking about a literal. I'm talking about a figurative release form, a verbal, the flight attendants on the airplane talking to the people in the emergency row. It's like, I want to hear an audible yes. And that's what I'm saying. Do I hear an audible yes? And it could feel a little pedantic, but I have learned if they're not on board with that, you should not proceed. It's not going to go well.
Stepping back a little bit with the idea of who you counsel and their willingness, what about, do you advise pastors that only counsel members of your church or regular attendees of your church? Or are you willing to counsel anybody that picks up the phone and calls the church and says, my wife and I need some counseling? We don't go to your church, but we have friends that go to your church and they said they recommend you.
Yeah. We've had that happen many times over the last 30 years. We established a standard protocol, which I ran by and was approved by the elders. I said, here's how I want to handle it. Someone from outside calls, they want help. We offer them one free consult. We don't charge for our consulting, but to put it in sort of layman's terms, we're going to listen and triage, and then by the end of that time, decide whether or not we think we can help you. And you're also listening because we're going to give you plenty of opportunity to know things like we're going to use the Bible. We're coming from a Christian perspective, and we're not going to apologize for any of that. So after that first session, we then say, I think we can help you, but you're going to have to sign up for Christianity 101. Well, what's that, they say? Well, in addition to our meeting, I want you to start attending the church on a regular basis, because everything I'm going to tell you is not going to make very much sense outside the context of the church. You're coming to our church service, you're hearing the teachings, you're frankly observing other couples to see how they're behaving is what will really help you to see that what we're talking about could be very useful to your marriage. So they have to decide to sign up for a Christianity 101. And I'll tell you this, Rob, we have never had an outside couple refuse to sign up for Christianity 101. Outside, unchurched. And we have seen literally dozens of couples come to Christ over the course of 30 years that started just like that. Maybe one was a Christian already, but in numerous cases, neither were. And we've seen them come to Christ. And it's been a fun thing to see. It's been a glorious thing to see the gospel work in that way. We had one couple that signed up for Christianity 101 and then started cutting class. We gave them a warning. We said, look, this is what you agreed to. You got to come to church. But after persistent non-attendance, we sat down with them and said, we're going to stop the counseling. They got very upset. Like I thought, we're not charging you a nickel. You agreed to these terms. You're not fulfilling it. we're not going to continue doing it. And of course, it was our fault, but that's par for the course. But that's the only couple in 30 years that we ever had that happen to.
Wow. So are you saying that gospel counseling is actually a gospel ministry?
Absolutely. Probably in terms of interpersonal involvement with people, it's probably been the most effective way of proclaiming the gospel with the most fruit, at least in my 30-year history.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think the gospel is most relevant to us when it's joined to a need. You know, as long as we think life is going great, plenty of money in the bank, the sky is blue, we've got life is like a tiger by the tail. I mean, everything's going nicely, smoothly. People don't really see their need, but now they got a marriage that's in decline. Maybe it's even, right on the brink of breaking up, and there's huge collateral damage with kids, with money. For the first time in their lives, they're not feeling in control. Or maybe it's the first time. So now they come, and what we're saying is, there is hope for your marriage. There's help for your marriage, but it resides in a single person, and his name is Jesus Christ. Well, you kind of have their attention. So whereas before, no attention at all, in fact, they might have thought you were an irritant, now it's like, well, nobody else is speaking that confidently. No one else is saying, we have the answer. And it's not us. It's Jesus Christ. It's his word is the answer. Because your problem is you're a sinner. That's why you're having trouble in your marriage. It's as simple as that. And Jesus is the only antidote to your sin. So I think there's needy people who hear the word of life.
Do you also see that among even church members where there's finally, or just regular church attendees, there's finally an opportunity for you to really engage with them because something's going on in their life?
That's right.
And you get together with them and really start to observe, ask good questions. And then you find out, or maybe they find out, I need the gospel. I'm not a Christian.
Well, that's right. It's like you go into the doctor's office or into the hospital with a certain set of presenting symptoms, and then they run the whole battery of tests, and they find out what you actually need is a gospel. This Christianity you have is really a veneer. It's a facade. It's not the real deal. Because you've been allowed to go into the inner sanctum of their lives, they've signed the release form, so to speak. You are able to help them have a more accurate view of themselves.
When you're talking to somebody, when you're counseling somebody, and they're coming to you for a particular problem they're having, are you looking beyond that problem for opportunities to address other things in their life that maybe help you diagnose maybe where they're at?
Not really, but I'm not assuming, just like no good doctor would assume, that the presenting symptoms are really the window into the problem. So you start with what you can see, but you are trying to help them understand what the real problem is. So, I come to the doctor with a headache. That's the presenting symptom. But it may be that I'm severely dehydrated, or it may be that I have a brain tumor. All I know is I have a headache. And a careful doctor, a methodical, thoughtful doctor is going to go through the paces to try to come up with an accurate diagnosis. And I think a soul physician is the same thing. He's listening to the presenting symptoms, but not assuming that those necessarily are the window into the problem. But it's not like you're looking for other things. You're really just trying to help them know what's going on in their lives. And ultimately, everything is spiritual. Everything is about the gospel. Everything is about the relationship with God. And so you're trying to ascertain where is the block, where is the tension, where is the twist in their relationship with God? What is it that they are wrestling with and struggling with? And that's what you're trying to help them do.
Do you have situations that you've had come across your desk, so to speak, your phone rings, and you don't feel qualified? Maybe this person needs a psychologist, a psychiatrist. I need to bring them to the emergency room. When does a pastor know this is maybe they shouldn't be talking to me? There's someone else they need to be talking to first.
Yes. Yeah. Certain physical symptoms, send them right to the doctor or send them right to the emergency room. Certain mental symptoms, my preference is a psychiatrist because a psychiatrist is a doctor. He's been to med school and then he specialized in psychiatry, so he's got the full package. So absolutely, there are things that are just above our pay grade. We're, ministers can deal with someone's spiritual life, but if there's these crises, either physically or mentally, you're not able to deal with anything. So you've got to get them the immediate help to deal with the immediate presenting symptoms.
Do you ever ask the question of somebody that you're counseling, are you on medication? Can I know that? Should I know that you're on an antidepressant, you're on an anti-anxiety medication, anything like that, so you know who you're talking to?
We're talking about that figurative release form. So if somebody has come for you for help, I don't assume they really want my help. They've presented as if they want my help, but I'm going to test that. And if they do, then part of the release form includes I need to be able to ask the questions that I think are relevant. So if somebody's coming and they're having an anxiety problem, it's a very relevant question to say, are you on any anti-anxiety medication or anti-depression medication? I need to know that. So again, it all depends on what the client, what the congregant really wants you to do. And I don't assume that I know that, even if they start off saying, here's what I need help with, because we may get into some difficult things. And, what they're seeing, something that they can't help, may be, in my analysis, something they can help. And here are some steps they can take to get control of their emotions, to not be in a victim mode. And that can produce some friction if you're not careful. So trying to clear the decks and say, I'd like to know if I have the freedom to go here if I think I need to go here, to go there if I need to go there. And the best situations are where they give you that freedom.
Is it typical for senior pastors of churches of 200, 300, 400 people to be doing the counseling? Is that common?
I don't know for sure the answer to that, but I suspect no. Christ Memorial at its peak was just under 500 people. I suppose a church that size, they've specialized by that time and they have a counseling pastor. I think it's important for the senior pastor to always be involved in counseling, even if he has a reduced load, because the church is larger. And here's why. The senior pastor is doing most of the preaching in a church, and that means that he's doing most of the work of trying to show the congregation how the word applies to their situation. If he's not in touch with the trials and tribulations of his people, the struggles of his congregants, his ability to make that word sing and sting and be relevant to help and encourage them is going to be limited. He's just not in touch. He's kind of flying high over the congregation. But if he's down in the trenches, he's sampling on a regular basis the struggles and the sins and the troubles of his people. And I think that just makes him a much better preacher. He's able to preach in a much more relevant way.
Yeah, I think I remember from a previous podcast that you said a preacher should be customizing their message for what's going on in their congregation. Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, you are. You are remembering that exactly right. My rule of thumb was that unless I could think of at least 5 people who were generally struggling with something, I didn't touch it on Sunday morning. But if I had at least 5 people, I thought, okay, there's more where that came from. This is a general problem that we all have, and it's fair game. Again, being very careful to protect confidentiality, very careful to not have that person feel like I took that counseling appointment and then I preached it on Sunday. But it just allows you to be better in touch with your congregation, causes people to say, I felt like that sermon was directed at me. Now that's a positive thing. You want them to feel like God is speaking to them. And if you're in touch with your congregation, which counseling probably does as well as anything, you're going to be able to deliver that.
Is there much training in seminary for counseling? If you're, Masters of Divinity type program?
Yeah, there's a lot of training in counseling. AC, BC certification is available at seminaries. A CCEF certification is available. These are good counseling organizations. My rub with those comes through in the way I've titled it, gospel counseling. Because one of the things that I don't think is a strength of those programs is the starting point that says, are we sure we're even dealing with a Christian? And in many of those cases, in many of those philosophies that undergird those counseling organizations, we're back to Romans 7. I don't mean to reduce everything to that, but if you think a believer can be in a position where he claims he is sold under bondage to sin, the counseling tack that you're going to take with someone presenting with some besetting sin is going to look different than the tack that I would take. And so because those organizations don't tend to have a real strong or robust notion that the counselees that are coming to them from their church may well be unbelievers, I think their starting point sometimes is compromised. But they're good organizations, and I appreciate them, Rob. That's a very, very fine-tuned, but nevertheless significant concern that I have.
Is this what you're doing with the Nets residents when it comes to counseling? Maybe they've got some background, they've got some training, but you're fine-tuning it in the residency program to help them really diagnose, almost preach to people in their counseling and help them see their state.
Yes, and it's one of the reasons that we work so diligently on exegesis of some of these critical texts. It's one of the reasons we lean so heavily into Jonathan Edwards. His paradigm is that saving faith, true religion, for the most part, lies in the affections. It's not just a bunch of things I'm doing, and it's certainly not just the creed I confess, but there's an actual profound ontological change in my inclinations, in my inner being, and those inclinations manifest themselves in changed behavior. So we're working very hard to help them to know the nature of true conversion, because when they get that counselee in their office, they're going to be interacting on the behavior of that counselee and wanting to be helpful. We don't know for sure, but wanting to be helpful in guiding them to think through what may actually be true of them. So yeah, we spend a lot of time in the residency program on that.
I've got some really just quick practical questions I'm curious about. How often do you recommend counseling someone if they've signed off? Is it once a week? Is it every other week? Do you meet for 30 minutes? Do you meet for an hour? These are some questions that I think I've heard people wonder about, and I'm curious from your experience.
I think it completely depends on the situation. There's scenarios that I can remember that Sue and I were involved with where we were doing things daily for at least a certain period of time. If you've got a chronic anxiety situation, but not enough to recommend they go to the hospital, and those are all judgment calls as well. Weekly is a very common recommendation if you're dealing with a type of a crisis, not a life-threatening kind of a thing, or even a marriage that's on the skids, but still a troubled situation. Weekly is a regular recommendation. Every 2 weeks. And then if a situation seems to be moving in a good direction, you might be monthly until you think it's stabilized enough that you can stop the counseling. So, yeah, all of the above.
Have you ever been in a situation where you may be in the middle of a 15 or 20-hour sermon prep and the phone rings and you got a deal? How do you handle that and still be true to your time to prepare for your Sunday sermon? How does that all work? Especially for a guy who's maybe got 100 or 200 people under him, and he's the counselor and the pastor and the preacher and all of it.
Well, in the short term, I think you just get less sleep. I mean, my pattern over the decades that I was a pastor was I studied all week, I wrote my sermon on Saturday, and I edited it Sunday morning. So I get a call, somebody's had a heart attack. They're in the hospital. It's the middle of Saturday. All right, I'll be right there. I think that's one of the occupational hazards. It's kind of like you are a bit of a firefighter. When the alarm rings, you got to answer it. You can't be frustrated about that or not expect it. And do the best you can. Trust God to give you the strength that you need to do what you need to do.
When do you decide to knock it off? Like, we're not getting where I thought we might be getting. They're not obstinate. They still want to counsel, but you're just not making progress. Do you ever just say, we need a timeout. Let's give it 6 or 8 weeks and let's get back to it?
Yes, we've done that. We've done that. Again, you're trying to discern, A, do they really want your help? And B, are you actually helping them? I mean, they could really want your help and you're just not really helping them. I'm a little nervous or suspicious of that because I think the gospel works. But you may not be the best person or an effective person to deliver that gospel to them. So you got to live with all kinds of possibilities there. But yeah, we've done that, and then we've come back and seemingly made some progress. Or we've done that, and we've never come back. You got to kind of live with that. Obviously, these are not church discipline kinds of situations. They're elective surgery, again, if you will. But yes, absolutely.
How important is it that the pastor's wife has these counseling skills, this experience, and that she's a part of some of these sessions, particularly with other women? Because I don't think you'll meet or recommend any pastor ever meet in person or counsel a woman between pastor and a female congregant.
Yeah, that's right. Never recommend that. I think it depends on the couple. You know, in the early days, Sue and I were the couples counseling. We were the couples counselors, and Sue did most of the counseling for the women. But, not too long into the church life, I hired a woman's counselor to relieve Sue of having to be that go-to person. She did a very good job. She and I would meet with counselees, female counselees. So, yeah, I don't think that the wife has to be involved, but if that's not her bent or interest, you got to find somebody.
Would you counsel women over the phone just like that, or do you always have another woman on the phone as well?
Yeah, that's trickier. In general, I don't want to be counseling women over the phone, but those situations have occurred, and I've made judgments about those and felt like at times that is appropriate, especially if it's a crisis. But it's always brought back around. It doesn't stay in that mode at all for any length of time. We'll set up an appointment for the three of us to sit down, or I may even say, it'd be better for you to talk to so-and-so right off the bat. But sometimes it's something that involves me, and I've made a judgment call on the phone to talk about it. But you got to be careful with that.
We talked about people being willing to counsel. What about the opposite? Do you ever have that where people just love it? It's sort of like their own life coach, almost taking advantage, where they just want to meet a lot and just talk about all kinds of stuff.
We're not interested in that. We're not trying to be sort of everybody's friend in that sort of sense. It's kind of like a doctor isn't going to allow a patient to come in and say, basically, there's really nothing wrong. I just like to meet with you and talk to you. Most doctors are just going to say, I don't have the bandwidth to do that. Those needs can be met just through general fellowship needs. So yeah, we really wouldn't go there. We want to be available to help people that are wrestling with the gospel, wrestling with sin in their lives, and the plate is full.
We talked about only counseling women with someone else in the room, obviously, usually another woman, your wife, potentially. Is there ever a time when you're counseling a man where you feel like I need another elder or two in the room, maybe a church discipline situation or just something sticky? What kind of advice, Wes, do you have for pastors where that's a good idea?
Yeah. I think it's a good idea to have someone else with you for any situation that you perceive could get, what's the word? A little snarky, could get a little accusatory, could be a scenario where it's going to be a he said, she said, he said, and you kind of have a feel for that. And if you misjudged a situation and it goes there, my recommendation would be hit the pause button and say, I think it would be better if we rescheduled, and I'd like to bring another elder in, if that would be all right. Now, there's some tension even with that, but you have to protect yourself. And if you're getting together with someone who's in that session starting to accuse you of things, spiritual abuse. I mean, everything gets thrown around these days. It's better to just stop and say, let's reschedule for next week. And I'd like to bring one of the elders along. Anyone in particular you'd prefer? Because I'm free to ask whomever I like. That'd be what I'd recommend there, just to protect the church and protect you.
Wes, as we're wrapping up this episode, I think this has been great. I think there's a lot of practical counsel, if you would, in this episode. How do you find yourself counseling differently at your age with the experience that you have versus maybe when you were only 5 or 10 years into it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think I listen better. I think I'm slower to come to a hypothesis about the situation. I think I'm gentler than I was. I think I'm allowing for struggles to be bigger struggles than maybe I was before, to recognize that the ravages of sin is greater than maybe I appreciated before. Those are some of the things that come to my mind right off the bat. I love what Mark Dever says. He says patience is a superpower, and I don't think I was a very patient young pastor, and patience in counseling pays off. The cash value there is you don't make judgments too quickly, so you give a situation time to present. And that's like a physical scenario. It's not always clear, but over time, the condition will have a greater likelihood to present itself. So just being willing to ride that wave and wait until the situation clarifies. Don't rush to judgment. I'm probably more patient in that regard.
So would that be your final advice for this episode for younger pastors, the 30, the 40-year-old, to just really try to be patient in these situations?
Yeah, be patient and take a really good patient history. Everybody is operating out of some context. Just like studying the Bible, you need to know the context. You need to know the context of someone's life. And it's not easy to get to know somebody. And unless you're dealing with a crisis that has to be addressed, they're ready to walk out of their marriage. Okay, you can't say, well, I don't know the situation, I'm going to wait. Well, you wait, they're divorced, you're in big trouble. But if it's not that sort of situation, then make it your goal to try to really understand them. And I like the patient history analogy because a good doctor, a good primary care physician, is really trying to put their patient in a context. And so you're not rushing to judgment. You're really trying to learn. You're really trying to get the facts as best you can. So yeah, I'd recommend that. But that's slow, tedious work. There's not an instant result, and you don't go on to some counseling WebMD and get the answer to their situation. You've got to be willing to take the time that it takes to really appreciate a person's unique circumstances.
Yeah, a lot of work, a lot of hours, but I imagine extremely fulfilling for the pastor.
Well, when they gain a vision of Jesus Christ, either as a non-Christian and the Savior of their soul, or as the one who actually can deal with their situation, it's very satisfying. You're trying to lead them to Christ. You're trying to lead them to God and see that God is the answer to their situation if they'll just let Him work in their lives. Very satisfying, Rob.
Wes, thanks for the time. Thanks for the conversation.
You're welcome. It's good to talk to you. See you later, Rob.
To learn more about the Net Center for Church Planning and Revitalization's training and sending programs, visit us online at thenetcenter.org. For questions or comments, email us at pastorpastor@thenetcenter.org. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe and consider sharing this episode with a friend. This podcast is a production of the Net Center for Church Planning and Revitalization. Nets, for the life of the church.